Aeskiel was born in a kingdom carved between endless dunes, a land where the horizon burned gold at sunrise, and the nights hummed with desert winds that carried stories of ancient warriors. From the moment he learned to walk, he understood that the world around him respected only one thing: power. Warriors trained with spears until their hands bled, generals marched in shining armor, and kings ruled through fear. His father, General Makarios, believed the same. A leader must be harder than stone, he used to say, gripping Aeskiel's shoulder with a force that made the boy wince. If you show softness, you lose everything. But Aeskiel saw the world differently. While the sons of noble families trained to fight, he spent his mornings feeding stray animals by the river. He would help old traders load their camels, sit beside crying children, and listen to travelers talk about faraway lands. Many whispered that Aeskiel was too gentle to survive, let alone lead. Some even mocked him. Kindness, they laughed, that has no place in a kingdom built on conquest. He didn't argue, he simply watched, quietly learning people's fears, their hopes, and their wounds. He believed that understanding hearts was more important than conquering lands. Everything began to change on the night when the sky was bruised purple by a storm rolling over the desert. General Makarios returned victorious from a distant battle, bringing with him a single prisoner, dragged by chains behind his horse. The man was young, barely older than Aeskiel, and so badly wounded that he collapsed in the courtyard. Soldiers spat at him as they passed. Servants avoided his eyes. To them, he was an enemy, a symbol of victory and dominance. To Aeskiel, he was simply a human being in pain. Later that night, while the palace slept, Aeskiel slipped out of his room with a small clay bowl of water and a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. He found the prisoner tied to a wooden post, shivering in the cold. The boy approached cautiously, his heart racing, but the prisoner lifted his head weakly and whispered, "Please, help." Aeskiel knelt beside him, offering water and bread. "Don't be afraid," he murmured. "I won't hurt you." The prisoner's eyes filled with disbelief. No one had ever shown him compassion in the enemy's land. His name was Lorien. Over the next days, Aeskiel returned to care for him, cleaning his wounds and shielding him from soldiers who tried to mistreat him. Lorien slowly regained his strength, and with it, trust. He began to talk, first in broken sentences, then in full stories. One night, sitting under the flickering torchlight, he told Aeskiel something that made the young prince's blood run cold. Europe's greatest and most feared army, the Iron Crusaders, were preparing to march south. They were powerful, disciplined, and ruthless. Entire kingdoms had fallen before them. Lorien was one of many scouts, sent months ahead to gather information. He had been captured before he could return. Aeskiel sat in silence, his fingers curled tightly around the edge of the clay bowl. His kingdom, though prosperous, was small. Their warriors were brave but few. Facing the Iron Crusaders meant certain destruction. Everyone would soon look to his father for answers, and one day they would look to him. He knew what his father would do. He would gather the armies, forge alliances with neighboring tribes, and prepare for a war soaked in blood. He would retaliate before the invaders arrived. He would burn whatever needed to be burned, sacrifice whoever needed to be sacrificed, because that was how leaders survived. But Aeskiel felt something shift inside him. For the first time, the idea of leadership didn't just feel heavy. It felt terrifying. The world believed that only cruelty could stop cruelty. But was that truly the only path? He looked at Lorien, the enemy who no longer felt like one. A boy who should have been killed, humiliated, or discarded, yet was now alive because of one simple act: kindness. A thought formed in Aeskiel's mind, clear as the desert stars. Kindness had changed Lorien. And maybe, just maybe, kindness could change something far greater. Still, he hesitated. What could one young prince do against an army that shook continents? What power did gentleness have against swords? Lorien seemed to sense the war inside his mind. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "That is something no general, no king, no warrior in my land would have done. You think kindness is weakness, but I have seen kingdoms fall because their leaders were too proud to show mercy. Strength that has no heart collapses faster than you think." Aeskiel exhaled slowly. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from realization. He was different, and maybe that difference was his greatest strength. He made a choice that night, a choice that would shape the destiny of nations. He would not treat Lorien as a prisoner, but as a guest. He would hide him, protect him, and learn everything he could from him. He would prepare not for revenge, but for survival built on wisdom, compassion, and unity. For years, Aeskiel had believed kindness was something small, something quiet. But now he understood the truth. Kindness was a weapon, one the world had forgotten. He didn't know it yet, but this choice would someday make him the king who dared to stand against Europe's greatest army and win. Aeskiel's rise to the throne happened neither with celebration nor chaos. It happened with a kind of quiet inevitability. When his father fell ill after years of battle and hardship, the kingdom held its breath. General Macarios had been a fierce symbol of strength, a man feared by enemies and respected by allies. Many believed that without him the kingdom would crumble. Many also believed Aeskiel, the gentle prince with soft eyes and uncalloused hands, could never fill the shoes of such a man. But Aeskiel wasn't trying to fill anyone's shoes. When the council elders gathered in the palace hall, their robes brushing the marble floor like dry leaves, they expected a frightened young man. Instead, they found him standing tall, calm, and strangely composed. He bowed respectfully and said, "My father ruled with strength. I will rule with wisdom. Together, these will protect our people." His voice was steady, without the trembling of fear or hesitation. The elders exchanged glances. They had misjudged him. As days passed, the people began to witness a new style of leadership, one that their land had never seen. Aeskiel walked through the markets, speaking to merchants like an equal. He visited farms at dawn, helping plant seeds, asking about soil, water, and harvests. He sat with schoolchildren, listening to them read aloud. He met poor families himself and ensured they received grain during drought. These were acts no king before him had ever bothered with. Whispers spread that Aeskiel was too soft, too simple, too unguarded. But the same whispers slowly transformed into admiration. People began saying that when the king looked at you, he didn't look through you. He saw you. His kindness created something that warfare never could: unity. For the first time in generations, tribes that had once feuded now traded peacefully. Neighboring villages that had long distrusted the crown now offered loyalty freely. Even former enemies, small bands of raiders, old rivals of his father, found themselves negotiating peace treaties instead of sharpening their blades. But as peace grew inside the kingdom, a dark cloud grew outside it. Rumors began arriving from the north, rumors that chilled even the bravest hearts. The Iron Crusaders, Europe's largest and most feared military force, had begun movement again. They marched under a silver banner marked with a black cross, leaving cities in dust wherever they stepped. Their general, Alaric, was known for his brutal precision. His army was so disciplined that their footsteps sounded like a single heartbeat. When the news reached the palace, the council panicked. They held urgent meetings, their voices rising like storm winds as they debated what to do. "We must strike first," one advisor insisted. "We must send assassins to cut down their leaders," another argued. "Gather every soldier, every blade, every archer, call the tribes, prepare for war," shouted a third. But Aeskiel remained quiet until they finally turned to him. "We will defend our home," he said, "but we will not become monsters to defeat monsters." The council was stunned. It was unthinkable. How could they survive without matching brutality with brutality? How could a small desert kingdom stand against the most powerful army Europe had ever produced? Many believed Aeskiel was naive, but deep inside, he was not driven by innocence. He was driven by memory. The memory of Lorien, the boy who came as an enemy but left as a loyal friend. The boy who revealed truths about the Crusaders, truths that could save the kingdom. Aeskiel summoned Lorien privately, in a quiet room lit by oil lamps. The air smelled of parchment and burning cedar. Lorien bowed, but Aeskiel shook his head. "You are not my prisoner," he said. "You are my brother." Lorien looked up with eyes full of emotion. He had never been called that before. Aeskiel asked him everything he knew: the Crusaders' formations, their weaknesses, their reliance on heavy armor, their blind loyalty to Alaric. Lorien spoke with honesty, sometimes pausing as painful memories resurfaced. Aeskiel listened to every word. With that knowledge, the king began preparing, not for a war of cruelty, but for a war of strategy. He strengthened defenses around villages. He ordered the training of new recruits, not to kill, but to protect. He invested in engineers who built mechanisms the Crusaders had never seen. He created secret tunnels for evacuation, stockpiled food, and improved communication between regions. But what shocked everyone the most was what he did next. He sent envoys to the border carrying water, dates, and olive branches. The envoys bowed respectfully before the Crusader scouts and said, "Our king welcomes peace. He does not wish for bloodshed, but he will defend every innocent soul who lives under his sky." To many, this act seemed foolish. To the Crusaders, it seemed like weakness. When General Alaric heard that a king had dared to approach his army with gifts instead of fear, he laughed in contempt and ordered his men to burn the nearest frontier village as a lesson. Smoke filled the horizon. Aeskiel rushed to the ruins. He lifted stones with his bare hands, pulled survivors from collapsed homes, and wept openly with grieving families. Warriors who followed him watched with disbelief. No king had ever stood among the ashes like this. And in that moment, Aeskiel made a promise, spoken not from the throne but from the charred remains of a home. "I will stop this army. I will protect this land, but I will not become like those who destroy." These words spread across the kingdom like wildfire. People who had never cared for politics, never cared for kings, now felt a fire inside them. Tribes who had once refused to help now offered warriors. Merchants donated supplies. Scholars offered ideas. Even former raiders came forward, saying, "We will fight for a king who would stand with us in the ashes." By choosing compassion instead of cruelty, Aeskiel gained something the Crusaders could never understand. A united people fighting not for land, not for glory, but for a leader who valued every life. The morning the Iron Crusaders finally appeared on the horizon, the world seemed to hold its breath. The desert wind, usually warm and gentle, blew cold across the plains as though it sensed the storm approaching. Villagers climbed rooftops to see what looked at first like a shifting silver mirage, but it wasn't a mirage. As the shapes sharpened, thousands of armored soldiers marched in perfect formation, their shields catching the sun in blinding flashes. Horses snorted through metal masks, and massive siege towers rolled forward like monsters made of wood and iron. Their footsteps shook the ground. It was as if a living wall of steel was sliding toward Aeskiel's kingdom. Aeskiel stood on the hill overlooking the plains, silent and still, a simple cloth cloak draped over his shoulders. Behind him, his commanders waited for orders, fear tightening their faces. They all knew the truth. The king's army was vastly smaller, barely a fraction of the Crusaders' size. Many believed the battle was already lost. But when they looked at Aeskiel, they saw no panic, no despair, only focus. Lorien rode up beside him, gripping the reins tightly. "They look even larger than I remember," he muttered. "Alaric has brought nearly his entire northern force." Aeskiel nodded slowly. "Then this will be the day he learns that numbers alone do not decide fate." He turned to his soldiers, who stood nervously behind him. Some were farmers with hastily sharpened tools. Some were seasoned warriors. Some were merchants who had volunteered because they believed in their king. Aeskiel walked among them, touching shoulders, meeting eyes. "I ask only this," he said with calm authority. "Do not fight with hatred. Fight with purpose. Fight for the people behind you. Fight for the children who sleep in their beds believing we will protect them." There was no roar of approval, just a deep, steadying silence. The kind of silence that becomes strength. When the Crusaders reached the edge of the battlefield, General Alaric raised his hand. He sat atop a massive war horse, dressed in black and silver armor that gleamed like polished stone. His face was hard and expressionless, shaped by years of warfare. He gazed at Aeskiel's forces and smirked. "This is the army we traveled across continents to crush," he said to his officers. "This will take less than a day." But Alaric had no idea what awaited him. Aeskiel gave a quiet signal. Suddenly, his soldiers lit controlled fires across the plains, but not toward the enemy. They lit them behind the Crusader army. The flames rose quickly, creating a thick wall of smoke that the wind carried forward. Crusader soldiers coughed and stumbled, blinded by the sudden storm of ash. Horses reared in confusion. Drums and commands were muffled. The Crusaders could no longer see their own formations clearly. Then came the second strike. Aeschyl's engineers, hidden behind dunes, held mirrors crafted from polished bronze. As the sun rose higher, they angled the mirrors to reflect beams of light directly into the enemy lines. The Crusaders' metal helmets and shields turned the light into chaos. Mounted riders shielded their eyes. Archers struggled to aim. Alaric roared orders, but even he sensed confusion creeping through his ranks. Aeschyl's army did not rush forward. They moved with precision, using the terrain they knew better than any invader. They lured enemy units into narrow passes filled with shallow trenches. Horses stumbled into them, not deep enough to injure, but enough to break formations. Foot soldiers fell over each other as hidden ropes tightened around their ankles. Nothing Aeschyl ordered was cruel. It was clever, patient, disruptive. For the first time in his career, General Alaric felt uncertainty. He signaled his elite knights to break through the right flank. They charged like a metal tide, but Aeschyl had predicted this. His archers, few in number but expertly positioned, waited until the last moment. They released arrows not at bodies but at the ground in front of the horses. The sand exploded upward in clouds, spooking the animals. Riders toppled. The charge collapsed in a wave of confusion. Alaric clenched his teeth. This enemy wasn't fighting like any he'd faced. They weren't meeting force with force. They were dismantling his army piece by piece, not through brutality, but through intelligence. Aeschyl watched the unfolding chaos with sorrow, not joy. He whispered, "Let this end with as little blood as possible." As the day wore on, something extraordinary happened. Crusader soldiers, separated from their units, injured or exhausted, found themselves face to face with Aeschyl's forces. Instead of killing them, Aeschyl's soldiers offered water, bandages, shade. Some Crusaders were so stunned they simply sat on the ground, unable to comprehend what was happening. Kindness on a battlefield, this was unheard of. Word spread quickly through the enemy ranks. The Black King spares us. They are healing us. They are not like the others. Fear began turning into doubt. Doubt turned into hesitation. And hesitation began breaking the invincible aura of the Iron Crusaders. By late afternoon, Alaric's massive formations were fractured and panicked. Stricken, Aeschyl gave the final signal. His troops encircled the Crusaders, not with killing intent, but with overwhelming control. Alaric's men saw they were surrounded. They could fight to the death or surrender. For the first time in his life, General Alaric realized he had been outmatched, not by brutality, but by brilliance and heart. He dropped his sword. A silence fell across the battlefield. Thousands of Crusaders followed their general's lead. Aeschyl had done what no king had ever done before. He defeated Europe's greatest army without letting hatred stain his soul. The battle was over, but the world had not yet witnessed the most shocking part of Aeschyl's legacy. The battlefield grew quiet as the sun dipped behind the dunes, painting the sky with deep orange and fading gold. What had begun as a horizon filled with steel and thunder had ended in an almost unreal silence. Thousands of Crusader soldiers stood, or knelt, surrounded not by executioners but by men offering water, cloth, and shelter. The desert wind swept gently across the plain, cooling the fear and heat that had burned all day. Yet the greatest moment of all was still to come. General Alaric, a man whose name caused entire kingdoms to tremble, was brought before Aeschyl. He expected humiliation, chains, and a violent death. Every other commander he had met would have celebrated his capture with cruelty. He braced himself for insult and fury. Instead, Aeschyl dismissed his guards with a wave of his hand. The king stood alone, facing the man who had burned his villages and slaughtered his people. Aeschyl's cloak fluttered quietly in the evening wind, and his eyes held no hatred, only exhaustion, wisdom. Humanity, Alaric struggled to understand it. You defeated my army, he muttered, voice gravelly and bitter. I suppose now you will parade me through your kingdom, drag me in chains, or strike off my head to impress your people. Aeschyl's reply was soft, but it pierced deeper than any blade. No, General, I do not punish defeated men out of pride. Alaric stared, unsure whether it was mockery or madness. Why spare me? He spat. I slaughtered your villages. I destroyed your homes. I would have killed you without hesitation if given the chance. Aeschyl stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. Because if I repay cruelty with cruelty, I teach my people to become the very thing I want to protect them from. I will not allow your darkness to spread through my kingdom. For the first time, Alaric faltered. Something in the king's words shook him, not because they were powerful, but because they were completely unfamiliar. He had grown up believing mercy was weakness, that fear was the only path to victory. But here was a man who had defeated him not through fear, but through honor. Aeschyl continued, Your soldiers will not be tortured. They will be fed, healed, and given rest. Then they will return home. Alaric jerked up his head. You would free us, yes, Aeschyl said, on one promise, that you will carry my message back to Europe. Tell your kings and commanders that this kingdom seeks peace, but it does not bow to cruelty. The general's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He had expected to die on this desert plain. Instead, he was being handed a second life. He felt emotion rise in his chest, an unfamiliar weight that made breathing difficult. You are a greater king than any I have known, he whispered, bowing his head not in defeat, but in genuine respect. Aeschyl's soldiers watched from afar, stunned. Many had lost family and friends to the Crusader attacks. Some silently questioned their king's mercy, but they trusted him, they always had. They believed in the strange and powerful wisdom that guided him. In the days that followed, the battlefield became a camp of healing. Wounded crusaders were tended alongside Aeschyl's own soldiers. Horses were fed, wounded men were sheltered. Instead of bitterness, conversations began. Former enemies, separated by continents and cultures, shared food, stories, and music. The animosity that had divided them slowly dissolved under the warmth of kindness. Lorien walked through the camp, watching with tears in his eyes. He remembered the day Aeschyl had saved him, one act of compassion that had changed the course of history. Now he watched Aeschyl saving thousands. When Alaric and his remaining soldiers finally departed, they marched not like conquerors, but like transformed men. No chains, no humiliation, only the weight of a message they now carried willingly. Europe expected Alaric to return with tales of victory. Instead, he returned with a story that stopped even the hardest kings in stunned silence. He spoke of a black king who fought not with hatred, but with strategy as sharp as lightning. A king who protected his people without spilling unnecessary blood. A king who spared an enemy army simply because he believed mercy was the only way to end an endless cycle of destruction. The stories spread faster than arrows across borders. Soldiers who had once eagerly supported the Crusades now questioned their purpose. Villagers whispered Aeschyl's name in admiration. Kings who planned to send reinforcements quietly withdrew their support, fearing they would be remembered as destroyers, while Aeschyl was remembered as a symbol of justice. Within months, the Crusader campaigns collapsed. No one wanted to fight a man who refused to hate them. Diplomats traveled to Aeschyl's kingdom bearing gifts, asking for alliances, seeking guidance. Traders arrived from regions that had never before set foot in the desert. Former enemies sent letters of respect. Aeschyl had not just won a battle. He had changed the conversation of nations. Peace returned to his kingdom, stronger than ever, not because the world suddenly became kind, but because his kindness had made war unnecessary. He had proven something the world had long forgotten, that mercy could be mightier than steel. Years later, travelers would still cross the desert to visit the kingdom of the king who fought without cruelty. Parents told their children stories about him, stories of the monarch who could have ruled through fear but chose compassion instead. They called him many names, the gentle king, the desert lion, the star of peace. But across continents, one title echoed through generations, the Black King who defeated Europe's greatest army.